Spending. I spending more money. Spending on spending to spending. I've been spending or we spending and spend a little more. Spending. Spend a lot. Spending money on out of control government spending. Spend on spending. We spending money. Spent. I've been spending money was spent. Spend. We spent too much to spend a little more. Spending so much. Spending a lot. Spend that money. Spending. I spend your tax dollars. We spent $1 trillion at war. To spending money. Spending. That's money I can spend somewhere else. Spending money to be spent on spending. Spending money, spend it quickly. Spend too much spending. Spend our money on spending. The spending issue. Spending those dollars, spend money to spend it. Money was spent, spending, government spending. We're spending. Spend millions of dollars to spend. Spend more, spending. I spent a lot. I was willing to spend. Spending. The money has been spent on spending again. Spend. More and more spending. I'm spending. To spend. I'd like to spend. Let's try to win some money. To spend. Spending. We're going to have to spend money on. Spend unlimited money. Spend unlimited amounts of money. Spending money. Limitless spending and spending. To spend. We spend. Spending. That I spend. Spending. Spend more. That I spend. Spending millions. Spent a lot of money. Spend more. I spend money on spending. And spending. Government spending's out of control. So we had to spend that. To spend. Spending. Spend a lot. Spend on spending. To spend. I spend a couple $1 million. Spend that money. Spend. I want to spend government spending. I want to spend that money. Spend millions of dollars. To spend more dollars that we're spending right now. We've got money to spend. Spending money. Spend some money. Spending some money. Spend the money to spend on spending. To spending. Government spends more. Our government was spending your tax dollars. Spend. That's a lot of money. Spend. Spending. We need to spend. Spend a lot. Spends a huge amount of spending. To spending, and bank bailout, spent blob of spending, tax and spend, spending. By spend. I want to spend a bunch. Spending on spending, spend the money, spend. Spending out of control to spend without limit. Spend on my watch. Most of the money we spent on the banks. As a result, millions of Americans had more to spend on gas, to spend millions on corporate spending. Spending at usaspending.gov. Spending millions of dollars. Spending a whole bunch of money. Spending on spending. Public dollars are spend. Be happy to get this money. We need to spend that money. Spending that money can be better spent spending money. Spending a lot. Spending money. We spend on spending more spending. Spending to spend. I spent most of my time talking about spending money. Spending. Crazy spending in Washington. All this money was spent. Obama, he's a spendthrift. Obama's just spending crazy. Look at these huge trillion-dollar deficits. Big spending Obama.